On Father's Day, my daughter invited me to a fancy dinner, saying she wanted to celebrate with me. But when I arrived, everyone was enjoying 300 gold-covered steaks and expensive desserts, while no plate was placed in front of me. My son-in-law's father pushed a bread basket toward me and said, "We didn't order anything for you." My son-in-law smirked. "You should have eaten before coming." I didn't argue or complain. I just smiled and said, "I'll remember this." When the waiter returned with the check, I paid only for my coffee, stood up, and made a quiet decision that changed everything. I'm grateful you're here with me today on Dad Family Revenge. Before this story goes any further, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, your city, your country? I read every single one. Note, some elements of this story are fictional, created for entertainment and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental, but the message I'm sharing with you matters. The last time I wore this jacket, my daughter was 22 years old, and the whole world was in front of her. I stood at the bathroom mirror that Father's Day evening, straightening the lapels of the navy blazer Margaret had chosen for Emily's college graduation. The fabric had held up well, good wool always does, but the man inside it had changed considerably. 66 years old, 34 years of construction work living in my hands and my lower back. And for the first time in 4 months, my daughter had called me first. Emily's voice that morning had carried the warmth I remembered from before Ryan, before the distance had settled between us, like concrete curing in cold weather. I tried to hold on to that warmth during the 20-minute drive to Rosewood Grill. Margaret would have told me not to borrow trouble. She had a gift for that, for living in the moment she was actually in. I tried to carry that with me as I walked through the front door. The hostess met me with a practiced smile. "Reservation name?" she asked. "Hayes," I said. "Joining my daughter's party." She scrolled her screen, and something in her expression shifted by a fraction. "The reservation is under Caldwell. Party of 6. Already seated." Party of 6. I did the math in one breath. Emily, Ryan, Frank, and Diane Caldwell. 2 additional Caldwell relatives. 6 seats. Not 7. My chest tightened like a load-bearing wall, discovering it had been asked to carry more than the engineer intended. But I had spent 34 years walking into situations that were not what I expected. You assess before you react. So I squared my shoulders and walked toward the fireplace table. The table was magnificent. White linen, crystal glasses, plates crowded with food that cost more than my first car payment. Frank Caldwell occupied the head of the table the way a man occupies a chair he believes he owns. Diane sat at the far end, cutting her steak with small, precise movements. Ryan's new watch caught the light every time he reached for his wine glass. And Marcus, my grandson, 9 years old, and already wearing the serious expression of a boy who absorbs more than adults, sat in the middle working through a chocolate dessert. Emily saw me first. For 1/2 second, something crossed her face that looked almost like relief. Then Ryan said something close to her ear, and whatever I had seen was gone. She looked down at her plate, her hands pressed flat against her thighs. Frank looked up with the unhurried assessment of a man who has already decided what he thinks. "Walter." He said my name the way you say the name of something mildly inconvenient, then pushed the breadbasket toward the empty edge nearest me, the edge where no plate, no glass, no silverware had been set. "We didn't order for you. Help yourself to the bread." Ryan leaned back with a loose, unbothered smile. "You should have eaten before coming, Walter." I looked at him for a moment. "I'll remember this," I said quietly. I counted to 7. A job site habit, 7 seconds before responding to any unexpected structural failure, because the decisions you make in the first 2 seconds are almost always wrong. Then I sat down, ordered a black coffee, and when the check arrived 40 minutes later, I placed enough cash to cover exactly my portion and a generous tip. "My check," I said. "Just mine." Frank's face reddened from the collar up. "You're Emily's father." "I am Emily's father," I said. "But I have never been anyone's wallet." I said goodnight to Marcus, who watched me with those serious eyes. I looked at Emily one last time, hands flat against her thighs, eyes fixed on the tablecloth, and held her face in my memory, the way you hold a measurement you know you will need later. Then I walked out into the warm California evening. I had reached the third row of the parking lot when footsteps came behind me. "Oh, Mr. Hayes." Jordan, the server who had brought my coffee, pressed a folded note into my hand. His jaw was tight, with the expression of someone who had made a decision that cost him something. "3 months ago, the younger man at your table came in with another man. He said your name out loud, said you pay for everything. And while he waited for the check, he photographed the back of a credit card, the security code side." He met my eyes. "I didn't know whose card it was until tonight." I stood in the parking lot with a folded piece of paper in my hand and felt the ground shift the way it does when a site survey reveals the soil is nothing like the original report claimed. I sat in my car a long time before I started the engine. I saw what happened, Jordan had written. In 34 years of construction, I had learned one thing about structural failures. They never begin the day you discover them. They begin long before in corners cut when no one was looking. I drove home through the Pasadena night, paying very close attention to the ground beneath my feet. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning with Jordan's folded note in front of me and a cup of coffee gone cold, thinking about the way Ryan had said my name 3 months ago at that restaurant. Walter pays for everything. Not said to me. Said about me. The way you talk about a tool you keep in the shed, useful, reliable, not particularly worth consulting. At some point, the sky outside began to lighten from black to the gray-blue that arrives over Pasadena about an hour before sunrise. Margaret used to love that hour. She would sit by the window and watch the light come back without saying anything. I had never understood why until the mornings after she was gone, when I sat in her chair and felt the silence pressing in from all sides, like water finding its level. That Sunday morning, I did not sit in her chair. I opened my laptop and got to work. In construction, we call it a site inspection. Before you pour a single yard of concrete, you walk the ground. You do not assume the soil report from 10 years ago still reflects what is beneath your feet. I pulled up annualcreditreport.com. Under the Fair and Accurate Credit Transactions Act, every American is entitled to one free report per year from each of the 3 major bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. I had not checked mine in 18 months. That I realized with a sourness in my chest that had nothing to do with cold coffee had been a mistake. I read each report the way I read blueprints, left to right, top to bottom, nothing skimmed. My mortgage paid off. My one credit card, 0 balance. My car loan closed. Everything expected. Then I scrolled further, and my hand went very still on the mouse. A Chase credit card ending in 4417. Opened in January. Balance $23,000. I did not have a Chase credit card. I had not applied for one. I read that line 4 times and felt the same sensation I had felt once when the ground beneath a freshly poured slab gave a single definitive shudder, something fundamental wrong in a way that cannot be patched. All 3 bureaus confirmed it. 3 for 3. I opened my engineering notebook, the green graph paper one from 1987, and wrote the account number down. Then I found the second item, and my throat tightened so hard I had to set the pen down and breathe. A second mortgage on 847 Maple Drive, Margaret's house, filed February with the Los Angeles County Recorder. Lender a private company with a Nevada address. Amount $62,000. My hands were shaking when I reached the third item. I pressed both palms flat on the desk, a job site habit, reminding your body the ground is still there, and kept reading. A personal loan. $47,000. Burbank Community Credit Union. Signed in my name on March 14th. I pulled my travel folder from the drawer. March 14th, I was in Seattle for the annual ASCE conference. Alaska Airlines boarding pass. Marriott receipt 2 nights. Signed conference attendance log. While someone was signing that loan in Burbank, I was on the 14th floor of a downtown Seattle hotel, listening to a structural engineer discuss soil liquefaction. The person who signed that loan was not me. I drew connecting lines between the 3 items in my notebook. Then I wrote a number at the bottom and circled it twice. $132,000. I turned to a fresh page and wrote one word in the center, pressing the pen down hard enough that the letters showed through to the page beneath. Marcus, my grandson, 9 years old, with his serious eyes and his baseball glove smell. I felt my heart clench the way it had not clenched since the night Margaret died, a tightening so complete it was almost structural, like a cable under load finding its limit. My phone buzzed. Jordan Cole. I think I saw something else. Would you be willing to meet? I looked at his message. Then I looked at the page, 3 connected lines, one circled number 1 name pressed deep into the paper. I wrote 4 words at the bottom. The foundation has been compromised. Then I went to make fresh coffee. Because whatever was coming, I intended to be awake for it. Dennis Okafor has had the same office on Brand Boulevard in Glendale for 22 years. I had been there exactly twice before, once when Margaret and I updated our wills, once when I needed a contract reviewed before the largest project of my career. Now I was there a third time on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, carrying a manila folder and a graph paper notebook with $132,000 circled on the third page. The office smelled the same as it always had. Old coffee printer, toner, law books that were consulted rather than displayed. Dennis was at his window when I came in, looking out at Brand Boulevard with his hands clasped behind his back, and he turned with the expression of a man who had already decided to clear his afternoon. Walter. He crossed the room and shook my hand firm. 2 pumps, no theater. Dennis Okafor was 58 years old, built like the offensive lineman he had been at UC Davis 4 decades ago, and possessed of a stillness I had always found steadying. We had been friends since our sophomore year, through careers and marriages and the losses that arrive in your 60s, whether you have prepared for them or not. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice," I said. "Sit down and stop thanking me." He gestured to the straight-backed client chair. "You drove 40 minutes on a Tuesday. Whatever's in that folder is not nothing." I sat. I opened the folder. And for the next hour and 40 minutes I told him everything. I am not a man who speaks easily about things that have hurt me. Margaret used to say that getting a feeling out of me was like extracting a structural beam, technically possible, but you needed the right equipment and a clear afternoon. But I had spent 3 days with this weight pressing against my chest, and by the time I began laying documents across Dennis's desk one by one, the words came faster than I expected. The dinner, the breadbasket, Jordan's note, the credit reports, the loan signed in my name while I was in Seattle, the second mortgage on Margaret's house. Dennis did not interrupt once. He sat with his forearms on the desk, eyes moving between my face and the documents, writing in his yellow legal pad with the focused efficiency of someone building something as he listened. When I finished, the only sound was Brand Boulevard traffic 4 floors below. Dennis set his pen down. looked at the documents, then looked at me with the expression I recognized from both previous times. I had sat in that chair, the expression that meant he was about to say something I needed to hear and would not enjoy. Halter. I want to be precise with you because you deserve precision. He turned the legal pad so I could read it. 2 names under California law. The first, elder financial abuse. California Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 1.610.13. Wrongful taking or use of assets belonging to a person 65 years of age or older. You are 66, you qualify. He tapped the page. The second, identity theft. California Penal Code Section 535. Using another person's information without authorization to obtain credit. The Burbank loan. The Chase card. Both fit. He set the pen down and met my eyes. This is not a family disagreement. What you have described to me is a felony. Possibly 2. The word landed in the room and pushed the air out around it. Felony. I had known it was coming. I do not flinch from conclusions the evidence is pointing toward. But hearing it spoken by a man who chose words the way an engineer chose load tolerances made it real in a way the credit reports had not quite managed. My jaw tightened. My hands pressed hard against my knees. I breathed in through my nose, out through my mouth, and reminded myself that I had stood on job sites where the ground had failed, and people had been hurt, and the only useful thing in those moments was to stay in your body and think clearly. What do we do? I asked. We do nothing, Dennis said. For 4 weeks. Heat flashed up from my collar. Dennis, hear me out. His hand came up, not dismissive, but with the authority of someone who understands what impatience costs. You have evidence. Good evidence. But right now it is a pile of materials. What we need is a structure. We bring in a forensic document examiner for the signatures. We pull the full records from the Los Angeles County Recorder's Office. We do all of this before anyone on the other side knows we are doing it. The moment they know you are building a case, they start building a defense. He looked at me steadily. Right now they believe you are a 66-year-old retired engineer who had one bad dinner and went home. We keep them believing that for exactly as long as we need to. I thought about Ryan at that table with his loose, unbothered smile. I thought about Frank Call and the breadbasket. 4 weeks, I said. 4 weeks. Dennis nodded. Engineers build the structure before they pour the concrete, Walter. 1989, the Glendale overpass, you made the entire crew wait 3 extra days for the soil report, because you wanted to be certain. A small smile. Be certain now. Something in my chest loosened. Not relief, but enough to breathe against. One more thing, Dennis said, and his tone shifted. Emily. In my experience, there are 2 kinds of people on the other side of a situation like this. Architects and materials. The architect designs the structure. The materials are used to build it. He held my gaze. I'm not telling you which one your daughter is, but I need you to think about that question honestly, because it will determine how we proceed. The question settled in my chest, like a weight I was not ready to lift. I thought about Emily's hands pressed flat against her thighs. The half-second of relief on her face before Ryan said something in her ear and it was gone. I did not answer Dennis. I squared the papers in my folder and stood. 4 weeks, I said. Tell no one, he said at the door. Not a neighbor, not a colleague, no one. I drove home through Glendale as the sun dropped behind the San Gabriel Mountains and 3 blocks from the freeway entrance. I found myself slowing almost to a stop in front of a beige Craftsman on a quiet street. Emily and Ryan's house. Kitchen lights on. Ryan's car in the driveway. Behind one of those windows, my daughter was living a life I was only beginning to understand. I sat with the engine idling for 3 minutes. Then I drove home. I was starting to understand the blueprint. I just did not yet know how many floors it had. My daughter learned to cry on cue sometime between her sophomore year of college and her wedding day. I know this because I used to know the difference. When Emily was 9 and fell off her bicycle on the driveway, the cry that came out of her was ragged and immediate and real, the kind that arrives before the child has decided whether the hurt is worth the tears. When she was 16, and I told her she could not go to a concert 3 hours away, the cry that followed was constructed, orchestrated, deployed. Even then, I could tell. I just chose not to say so, because choosing your battles is its own kind of wisdom. The cry she arrived with on that Wednesday evening in early July was the second kind. I heard her car in the driveway at 7:45. I was at the kitchen table with coffee and the engineering notebook, reviewing what Dennis and I had discussed, and when the doorbell rang, I already knew from the hesitation between the first ring and the second who was standing on the other side. I opened the door, and Emily's arms came around me before I had fully processed that she was there. Her voice against my shoulder was broken and wet. "Dad, I'm so sorry about Father's Day. I need you to know I love you. I'm sorry." I held her. She was my daughter, and whatever else was true, she was my daughter. My chest ached with something that lived between grief and anger, like a crack in a foundation that has not yet decided which direction it intends to travel. "Come inside," I said. She followed me to the kitchen table, the table where Margaret and I had drunk coffee every Sunday morning for 18 years, the one with the ring stain on the right side from the mug Margaret always set down too hard. Emily sat in Margaret's chair. I poured her coffee without asking, 2 sugars, no cream, the same since she was 19. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at me with eyes that were genuinely red. The tears were real. They were just not necessarily for what she was saying they were for. "I want to make things right between us," she said. "I want Marcus to have his grandfather. I want things to be the way they used to be." "Tell me what that looks like," I said carefully. She reached into her bag and withdrew a cream-colored folder, thick, the kind that holds documents that matter. She slid it across the table with both hands, palms open. "Ryan and I have been talking. We're worried about you, Dad. You're 66, you're alone managing the house and finances by yourself. This is just a financial power of attorney. Standard stuff. So if anything happened, someone you trust could step in." Our attorney drew it up. I picked it up and read it, the way I read every document ever placed in front of me, first line to last, nothing skimmed, never assuming the summary matched what was actually written. 34 years of construction contracts had burned that habit into me. Margaret used to bring a book to contractor meetings because she knew I would be there until every clause had been accounted for. Page 1 was standard. Definitions scope a Burbank attorney firm I did not recognize. Page 2 outlined general powers, still within what Emily had described. Page 3 made my hand tighten on the paper. Buried in the third paragraph, written in the passive construction lawyers use when they want something present without being visible. Including, but not limited to, the authority to execute, modify, or terminate real property transactions on behalf of the principal without requiring additional principal signature, provided such transactions are deemed by the agent to be in the principal's best interest. Real property transactions, without requiring additional principal signature. My house. Margaret's house. 847 Maple Drive with the sage green front door and the rose bushes she planted in 2001. I turned to page 5. Quieter language there, but more dangerous. A provision allowing Emily to access my financial accounts if I was determined to be unable to make sound financial decisions. With that determination, left in a subordinate clause that took me 3 readings to locate, to the discretion of the agent. Emily could decide I was incapable. Then Emily could decide what to do about it. I set the document down and pressed my fingertips flat against Margaret's table. Breathed in through my nose slowly, the way I breathed on job sites when something had gone wrong and I needed to stay functional. Emily. My voice was quiet and level, the voice I used when a contractor had made an error that could not be undone. Did you really think I couldn't read these? Something flickered across her face, fast and gone. Her knuckles went pale around the mug. It's just standard language, Dad. Our attorney. Which attorney? I asked. Is this your attorney or Ryan's? The pause lasted exactly 1 second too long. 1 second is the difference between someone remembering a fact and someone deciding what to say. A lawyer Ryan knows, she said. He's very experienced. Did you read it yourself before you brought it here tonight? Her jaw tightened. Her eyes dropped to the table, that same retreat I had seen at Father's Day dinner behind a wall I was only beginning to understand. Then she looked back up, and her voice had changed. The warmth had been replaced by something flatter, more deliberate, the voice of someone delivering a message they had been given rather than composed. If you keep fighting us on this, Dad, you won't have many options left. Cold water. Not painful, clarifying. Because that sentence was not Emily's. The cadence was wrong. The vocabulary was wrong. Someone had written that line, handed it to her before she drove over, and she had delivered it. That told me something important about how much space she currently occupied in her own life. I slid the folder back across the table. Take these home. Read page 3 and page 5 carefully. Then come back and tell me in your own words, Emily, not anyone else's, what you think they mean. Her chin trembled once, genuine, that part was genuine. And then she put the folder in her bag and stood. She walked to the front door with her shoulders held carefully straight, the posture of someone holding themselves together through deliberate effort, and said goodnight in a voice barely above a whisper. I watched her car back out. Margaret's roses were blooming along the fence in the warm July air, indifferent to everything that had changed in the house behind them. I went inside and photographed every page of what she had forgotten to take with her. 20 minutes later, Dennis called. I sent you the photos, I said before he could speak. A pause. Pages turning. Walter. His voice shifted into the register he used when something was worse than expected. This is not standard estate planning. Whoever drafted this knew exactly what they were doing, and what they were doing was not for your benefit. This is a predatory document designed specifically to look like protection while functioning as extraction. This was not negligence. This was intention. I looked at the ring stain on the right side of Margaret's table. I know, I said. Get some sleep, Dennis said. Tomorrow we start building. I sat in the kitchen a long time after that with the smell of Margaret's roses coming through the screen door and the weight of what I was beginning to understand pressing down on my chest, like a load no single beam was designed to carry alone. I have met a lot of salesmen in 34 years of construction. The good ones are rare. They make you feel like the deal was your idea. They ask more than they state. They lean back instead of forward and let silence work for them. In 3 decades of contract negotiations, I had sat across from maybe 6 men who did that genuinely well, and I had respected every one of them even when I walked away from what they were offering. Ryan Caldwell was not one of the good ones. He arrived Friday evening, 2 days after Emily's visit. The way men like Ryan always arrive with props. A bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet mid-range, the kind that looks expensive from a distance. A collared shirt with the top button undone in the deliberate way that is supposed to communicate ease, and the smile broad and practiced, deployed with the confidence of a man who has found that most people respond to it before they have time to think about whether they should. I thought we could talk, Walter, just the two of us. No family drama, just a conversation. I put the wine on the counter without opening it and poured coffee instead. Ryan accepted his with a slight recalibration of the smile, the adjustment a performer makes when the stage is not what they rehearsed for. He sat across from me, crossed his legs at the ankle, and settled into the posture of a man who believes he is the most relaxed person in the room. He apologized for Father's Day first. Good eye contact. The right weight in his voice. The deliberate pause before apologize that signals sincerity to people who have not heard it manufactured before. I said noted and gave him nothing. He pivoted smoothly the way water finds a new channel when the first one is blocked. There's a development coming up in Burbank. Mixed-use residential above retail Great Bones. The developer needs equity partners who understand how to read a project. I thought of you immediately, 34 years in construction, Walter. You'd be perfect. What's the name of the company? I asked. Apex Development Group. Clean, immediate, prepared. Address, 1720 Commerce Drive, Burbank. Also clean. Also immediate. Attorney handling the agreements, a pause so small that someone not watching for it would have missed it entirely. A firm out of Westwood. I can get you their information. Minimum investment. $50,000 gets you a meaningful stake. He said it easily, like a man who discusses $50,000 figures before breakfast. Keep it in the family, Walter. That's all this is. I set my coffee down. Ryan, before I could consider anything like this, I need to run it by my attorney first. Standard practice. I have never signed a contract in my career without having counsel look at it. Something happened to his face. Not dramatic, he was too skilled for dramatic. The smallest possible version of a flinch. The smile stayed in place, but the quality of it changed the way a photograph of a smile is different from a smile even when every muscle is doing the same thing. Of course, he said. That's smart. I'll send you the prospectus this week. He stayed another 20 minutes talking about Marcus's baseball team and the traffic on the 210. Good at normalization, the tissue of ordinary conversation wrapped around the thing he had actually come for. I listened, refilled his coffee, and gave him nothing. When he left, he shook my hand with the firm, two-pump grip of a man who wants to be remembered as trustworthy. I watched his car leave the driveway. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the California Secretary of State's Business Search Portal, a public database containing registration records of every legally operating business entity in California. I typed Apex Development Group. No results. I tried variations. Nothing. The company Ryan had described with clean, prepared answers did not exist in any form California recognized. I wrote the address in my notebook and went deeper. The Los Angeles County Assessor's website confirmed 1720 Commerce Drive was a real two-story commercial building. I cross-referenced the tenant list. Suite A, dental practice. Suite B, insurance agency. Suite C, vacant. Suite D, Burbank Community Credit Union. The same building. The same credit union that had issued a $47,000 loan in my name on March 14th while I was in Seattle. Ryan had not picked that address randomly. He had picked it because he knew it. Because he had been there. Because it was part of infrastructure he had been building on my name long before he showed up with Napa Valley Cabernet and a rehearsed smile. I texted Dennis 3 words and the address, same building. Credit union. He responded in 4 minutes. I see it. I made fresh coffee. Somewhere across town, my son-in-law was driving home believing the conversation we had just had was the one that had actually taken place. He was wrong about that, but I was not ready yet to show him how wrong. Margaret used to say I was impossible to live with during a project. She was not wrong, and she said it without malice, the way you state a fact about the weather. Something true and beyond argument that you have simply learned to work around. When I was deep inside a problem, I stopped being fully present in the rooms I occupied. I would sit at dinner and answer questions with the top layer of my mind, while the rest of it was 3 floors underground, running load calculations on something no one else could see. She learned to recognize the particular quality of my attention when it was divided, and she developed the habit of putting her hand flat on the table when she needed me to come back. She would have put her hand on the table that night. It was past 2 in the morning. The kitchen table was covered credit report printouts, the notebook open to the page with the circled $132,000, a legal pad Dennis had given me. With his notes from our first meeting, the photographic copies of the POA documents Emily had left behind, and 3 coffee cups in various states of emptiness. I had turned off the overhead light and was working by the lamp on the counter the way I used to work late on job sites when the generator was running low enough light to see what mattered, everything else in shadow. In construction, when you suspect a structure has been compromised, you do not start with the most dramatic failure point. You start with what you can measure. You document what is objectively true before you allow yourself to decide what it means. So I took the graph paper notebook, the green-covered one from 1987, worn soft at the corners, that had traveled with me through 34 years of projects in California, Nevada, and twice in Oregon, and I opened it to a fresh page. I drew a box in the center. Inside the box, I wrote Walter R. Hayes, 847 Maple Drive, Pasadena, CA. Then I drew lines outward from the box, one for each item, and at the end of each line I wrote what I knew. Line 1, Chase Visa, ending 4417, opened January, balance $23,000, CVV photographed at Rosewood Grill by Ryan Caldwell, witnessed by Jordan Cole. Line 2, personal loan, $40,000. Burbank Community Credit Union, signed March 14th, forged. Alibi Seattle ASC Conference. Receipts confirmed. Line 3, second mortgage, 847 Maple Drive. Filed February, LA County Recorder. I drew a box around all 3 lines. Beneath the box, I wrote the total $132,000. The number at the bottom of the page was the same number I had written 3 nights ago at 2 in the morning when I had first pulled the credit reports. $132,000. It had not changed. I had not expected it to. But seeing it here mapped against 8 months of deliberate action made it feel different, not larger, but more defined. Less like a wound and more like a measurement. $132,000 of debt opened in my name over the course of 5 months while I had been 20 minutes away in this house doing the dishes and watching the evening news and trusting that the people who called themselves my family were what they claimed to be. My hands pressed flat on the table. Not shaking, I would not allow shaking, not at 2 in the morning, with no one to see it and nothing useful to be done with it. But the pressure of my palms against the wood was harder than it needed to be, and I was aware of that, and I let myself be aware of it for exactly 1 minute before I picked up the pen again. I drew a second diagram on the next page. This one was different. This one was not a financial map. This one was a timeline, a construction timeline, the kind I had made at the start of every major project, showing what had to happen, in what sequence, and what each step depended on for the next one to be possible. 8 months ago, Cascade Property Holdings LLC formed in Nevada. Anonymous ownership. 8 months ago, Ryan begins visiting Rosewood Grill using Walter's card details, source unknown at this stage. 5 months ago, second mortgage filed on 847 Maple Drive, using forged signature and fraudulent notarization. 4 months ago, Chase Visa opened in Walter's name. CVV obtained from photographed card. 3 months ago, Ryan photographs card CVV at Rosewood Grill witnessed by Jordan. 2 months ago, personal loan $47,000 signed at Burbank Community Credit Union using forged ID on day Walter was in Seattle. 1 month ago, Father's Day dinner, Walter refuses to pay, plan accelerates. 3 weeks ago, Emily arrives with POA documents drafted by Ryan's attorney. 2 weeks ago, Ryan arrives with Apex Development Group proposal company does not exist. I sat back and looked at the timeline. 8 months. This had been running for 8 months before I sat down at a table in a Rosewood Grill and ordered a cup of coffee instead of paying for someone else's steak. The dinner had not started this. The dinner had only been the moment when I had become inconvenient enough to accelerate the schedule. That realization moved through me the way bad news moves through you when you are a professional, not as shock because some part of you has been preparing for it, but as a kind of settling a weight, finding its final resting position. I had not been ambushed at that dinner table. I had been managed. For 8 months I had been an account that was being quietly drawn down, and Father's Day had been the moment the account holder noticed, and the managers had been forced to move faster than they had planned. I thought about Emily with her hands pressed flat against her thighs. I thought about what Dennis had said about architects and materials. I thought about Marcus with his baseball glove smell and his serious eyes and the question he had asked me in the parking lot after the dinner. "Grandpa, are you okay?" A question I had answered lightly because he was 9, and I had not yet understood what he was actually asking. I turned to the next page of the notebook. In the center of the blank grid, I wrote one word the way I had written it before, pressing down hard enough that the letters would show through to the page beneath. Marcus, my grandson, 9 years old, who had watched his grandfather walk out of a restaurant with a bread basket where a meal should have been, and had asked with his eyes whether the man he loved most in the world was going to be all right. My throat tightened until it hurt. My eyes burned in a way they had not burned since the night the hospital called about Margaret. And I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and breathed through it, and did not let what was building behind my eyes become anything more than pressure, because there was no one in this kitchen to witness it. And I was not a man who wept alone in the dark at 2 a.m. I was a man who finished his site inspection and then slept 4 hours and got back to work. But the burning stayed, and I let it stay because it was honest, and because Marcus deserved at least that much from me. I sat with Marcus's name pressed into the paper for a long time. Then I got up from the table, rinsed the coffee cups, turned off the counter lamp, and walked down the hall to the bedroom. I lay down on top of the covers without changing clothes the way I used to do on long project nights, and I stared at the ceiling in the dark. Sleep did not come for a long time, but when it finally did, my hands were still. Before I tell you what my grandson said to me that afternoon, the words that changed everything, drop a comment with the number 7 to let me know you're still here with me on Dad Family Revenge. I read every single one. Please note some elements in this story are fictional, created for entertainment and educational purposes. If that's not for you, it's completely okay to step away, no hard feelings at all. My grandson smells like sunscreen and baseball glove oil. Some days that is the most honest thing in my life. Emily dropped Marcus off that Saturday afternoon with a smile that did not reach her eyes and an excuse about errands that I did not believe. I did not say so. I just held the screen door open, and Marcus came through it the way he always did at full speed, sneakers squeaking on the kitchen floor, already talking about his baseball team before he had finished saying hello. I made grilled cheese sandwiches. We sat on the back porch in the July heat, Marcus eating with the focused intensity of a boy who has not yet learned to pretend he is not hungry, and I listened to him talk about his pitcher and his batting average and a kid named Tyler who had dropped an easy fly ball in last Tuesday's game. The oak tree in the backyard threw its shade across the porch steps. Margaret's roses were red and full along the fence. For 40 minutes, I forgot about everything else. That is what children do if you let them. They pull you into the present tense by sheer force of being in it themselves. Then Emily called from inside that she needed another 20 minutes, and Marcus set down the second half of his sandwich and looked at me with the expression I had learned to recognize over 9 years, the one that meant he was carrying something he had been told to carry and did not understand why. "So, Grandpa," he said, and his voice was smaller than his regular voice. Careful the way voices get when a child is repeating something an adult has rehearsed with them. "Are you really going to sell the house and go away?" My chest cracked open along a line I had not known was there. "Who told you that, buddy?" I asked. My voice came out steady. "I do not know how, Dad." He picked up the sandwich again, then put it back down. "He said if you don't help them, you'll go away, and I won't have a grandpa anymore." His chin wobbled once the genuine kind, the kind that arrives before a child has decided whether to be brave about it. "I don't want you to go away." I moved to the porch step beside him. I put my arm around his shoulders and felt how thin they were, how much weight they were being asked to hold for 9-year-old shoulders, and something in me went from cracked to broken, and then immediately, in the same breath, to decided. "Marcus." I waited until he looked at me. "I am not going anywhere. Not for any reason. That is a promise, and I do not break promises. Do you understand me?" He studied my face with the lie detector precision that children have, checking for the gap between what an adult says and what an adult means. He found no gap. His chin steadied. "Okay," he said. He picked up the sandwich and took a large bite, and within 30 seconds, he was talking about Tyler and the fly ball again. I sat beside him and listened and watched the roses move in the afternoon breeze, and I made a decision that had been approaching for days, and finally arrived in that moment on the porch step, quiet and complete, and not open for reconsideration. When Emily came to collect him an hour later, I hugged my grandson for a long time at the front door. He squirmed after about 4 seconds, which is appropriate. I let him go. I watched their car until it turned the corner. Then I went inside, picked up my phone, and called Dennis. "Dennis," I said. "Change of plans. We move now." A pause. Then, "I'll clear tomorrow morning." I set the phone down on Margaret's table and stood in the kitchen in the late afternoon light and felt for the first time since Father's Day that I knew exactly what I was building and exactly why. In 34 years of construction, the most valuable person on any job site was never the engineer or the foreman. It was the man who watched what happened and wrote it down. Jordan Cole had chosen a coffee shop in Arcadia called The Daily Grind, a narrow place on Huntington Drive with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, the kind of establishment that exists in the spaces between the places people plan to go. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall and a coffee he had not touched in front of him, and he stood when he saw me the way young people stand when they are nervous and trying not to show it. He was younger than I had registered at the restaurant. 24, he had said in his text, and I believed it. There was a quality to his alertness that belonged to someone still discovering the extent of what he was capable of noticing. He had the careful posture of a person who has learned to be unobtrusive and is only now beginning to understand that unobtrusive and invisible are different things. "Mr. Hayes." He extended his hand. His grip was firm and his palm was dry. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for reaching out," I said. I sat across from him and ordered a black coffee from the server who appeared, and then I folded my hands on the table and waited. In my experience, people tell you more when you do not rush them toward the part you want to hear. Jordan wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at the table for a moment, organizing something. Then he looked up. "I've been a server at Rosewood for 2 years," he said. "I'm in law school at night Southwestern downtown. I work the dinner shift 4 nights a week." He said this not as biography, but as context, the way a witness establishes their position before they begin their account. "I notice things. It's part of the job and it's part of what I'm learning to do in school. You pay attention to what people do when they think they're not being watched." "What did you notice?" I asked. "The first time your son-in-law came in was about 8 months ago." Jordan's voice steadied as he moved into the account, the way voices do when the facts are solid. "He had dinner with another man, older, maybe 60, silver hair, very deliberate about how he sat. They talked for almost 2 hours. At the end of the meal, your son-in-law paid with a credit card. When the card came back in the folder, he opened it, took the card out, and held it face down for a moment." Jordan paused. "I was clearing the adjacent table. I saw him use his phone, the camera, not to make a call. He photographed the back of the card. Then he put it away and signed the receipt like nothing had happened. My coffee arrived. I did not pick it up. He came back twice more after that." Jordan continued. "Same card each time. The third visit, about 3 months ago, he came in with a woman I didn't recognize. During that dinner, he said your name, loudly enough that I heard it from 2 tables away." Jordan's jaw tightened slightly. "He said, 'Walter pays for everything that's not your concern.' And the way he said it—" He stopped, chose his next words carefully. "It wasn't the way you talk about someone who has agreed to pay. It was the way you talk about something you have access to." The accuracy of that distinction hit me somewhere behind the sternum. I picked up my coffee and held it without drinking. "On Father's Day," Jordan said, "when he introduced you at the table, when I heard your full name, I put it together. I knew whose card it had been." His voice tightened with something that was not quite guilt, but lived next door to it. "I should have said something the first time I saw it. I didn't because I told myself I wasn't sure. But I was sure. I was just afraid of being wrong about someone who tips well and smiles at the staff." He met my eyes directly. "I'm sorry it took me this long. You came forward," I said. "That's what matters." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded sheet of paper, a printed copy, slightly creased. "I went to the manager and asked for the archived receipt from that first dinner. She printed it for me. The last 4 digits of the card are on there." He slid it across the table. "I thought you might need it." I unfolded the paper. The receipt was dated 8 months ago. Dinner for 2 total $312. At the bottom, in the standard format, card ending in 4417. The Chase Visa. The card that had been opened in January, but whose security number had apparently been obtained 3 months before that, at a dinner I had never attended at a restaurant I had never visited, paid for with a card that at that point existed only as a plan. My hand was very still on the paper. I said, "What, you saw the photograph of the back of the card? That was not someone checking the card number. The back of a credit card carries one thing of specific value." I turned the paper over so the blank side faced up, and I wrote 3 letters on it. CVV. Card Verification Value. It's the 3-digit security code that allows online transactions. Without it, a stolen card number is significantly less useful. With it, I set the pen down. With it, you can open accounts, make purchases, build debt in someone else's name. He collected the security information months before he used it, building the profile first, then building the debt. Jordan looked at what I had written. His face changed, the particular expression of a law student watching a concept move from the textbook into the real world. So he wasn't just skimming the number. He was collecting everything he needed to build a complete profile. Yes, I said. We sat with that for a moment. Outside on Huntington Drive, traffic moved past in the ordinary way of Saturday afternoon, indifferent to everything being said at our corner table. Jordan. I said, I am going to be working with an attorney on this matter. It is possible that at some point someone may want to speak with you formally about what you witnessed. I want to be clear that I am not asking you to do anything right now. But if that time comes, would you be willing to give an account of what you saw? He did not hesitate. His chin lifted slightly, the way it does when someone has already made a decision and is simply waiting to be asked for it. Yes, he said. I would. I folded the receipt and put it in my jacket pocket. You're going to make a very good lawyer, Jordan. For the first time since I had sat down, something in his expression loosened, not quite a smile, but the relief of a person who has done the right thing and been told so by someone whose opinion they respect. I paid for both coffees. It was $11. I left 20 and did not think about the amount for even a moment. Outside on the sidewalk, I stood in the Arcadia afternoon and looked at the receipt in my hand. Nobody photographs the back of a card by accident. Nobody builds an 8-month financial operation on impulse. What Ryan Caldwell had done was designed and designed carefully, and the design had a flaw, the same flaw that compromises most structures that are built without a proper foundation. He had been seen. Dennis laid everything out on his conference table the way I used to lay out blueprints, one sheet at a time, north to south, left to right, until the whole structure was visible and nothing was hidden in a corner you had not looked at yet. I had worked with a lot of attorneys over the years. Construction contracts permit disputes. One memorable disagreement with a county inspector that had required legal intervention, and most of them organized their thinking in language. Dennis organized his in-space. Documents had positions. Evidence had sequence. By the time he was finished arranging, the table looked like a job site at the planning stage, and I felt for the first time in weeks that I was in a room where the work was being approached correctly. "Oh, here is where we are," Dennis said, standing at the head of the table with his legal pad. "And here is where we need to get." He walked me through 5 steps, and I wrote each one in the green notebook. Step 1, file a formal identity theft report with the California Attorney General's office and with the Federal Trade Commission through identitytheft.gov. This created an official record, a legal timestamp establishing that Walter Hayes was a victim, not a participant. Once that report exists, Dennis said, every subsequent action we take is documented as responsive rather than offensive. That matters in court. Step 2, freeze credit at all 3 bureaus, Equifax, Experian, TransUnion, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Free immediate, and it slammed the door on any additional accounts being opened in my name. This should have been done 2 weeks ago, Dennis said without accusation. We do it today. Step 3, file formal disputes with Burbank Community Credit Union and with Chase Bank, attaching the Seattle alibi documentation, the airline receipt, the hotel record, the conference registration. The burden shifts to them, Dennis explained. They issued credit on a fraudulent application. With a documented alibi, the liability is not yours. Step 4, retain Patricia Walsh, a forensic document examiner in Pasadena, to analyze the handwriting on the loan application, the Chase card application, and the mortgage filing. Compare against known samples of Ryan's handwriting from documents he had signed legitimately. If Patricia finds what I think she'll find, Dennis said, we have scientific evidence of forgery, not suspicion, evidence. Step 5, and here Dennis paused, turned the legal pad over and looked at me directly. Step 5 was the Los Angeles County Recorder's Office. A full search of every document filed under my name in the past 12 months. I want to run it now, he said, and he turned to his computer. The search took 4 minutes. I watched Dennis's face while he read the results, because I had spent a career reading faces in the moments when information arrived, and Dennis Okafor's face was telling me something before his mouth did. He was still for 3 seconds. Then he said, Walter, come look at this. I came around the desk and looked at the screen. A grant deed. Filed 6 weeks ago with the Los Angeles County Recorder's Office. The document transferred 40% of the ownership interest in 847 Maple Drive Margaret's house, my house, the house with the sage green front door, to an entity called Cascade Property Holdings, LLC, registered in the state of Nevada. The signature on the transfer document read, Walter R. Hayes. My jaw tightened until I felt it in my back teeth. My hands gripped the edge of the desk, and I held on the way you hold a railing when the ground moves, not because you have decided to hold on, but because your body does it before your mind catches up. The notary, Dennis said, scrolling down. He read the name aloud and then typed it into a separate search. 30 seconds later, 2 complaints filed against this individual with the California Secretary of State's Notary Division, both for the same violation, certifying signatures without the signer being physically present. That is a violation of California Government Code Section 8214. He looked at me. Someone paid this man to stamp a document he never should have touched. I straightened up from the desk. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the particular physiological response that arrives when the scale of something exceeds what you had prepared yourself to absorb. How long? I asked. Dennis understood the question. The LLC was formed in Nevada 9 months ago, before Father's Day, before the credit card, before the loan. He set the pen down. Walter, this was not reactive. They were not responding to anything you did. This plan existed before you refused to pay that dinner check. You refusing to pay that just accelerated their timeline. I stood at the window of Dennis's office and looked out at Brand Boulevard and felt the full weight of that settle into my chest, like concrete finding its level. They had not decided to come after me because I had embarrassed them at a restaurant. They had already been coming. The dinner had only been the night I finally looked up and saw it. What about the total? I asked. The real number. Dennis pulled up the figures. The second mortgage is $62,000, not what you originally calculated. Combined with the Chase balance and the personal loan, he wrote it on the legal pad and turned it toward me. 132 $132,000. That, I said, is the number we are recovering. Dennis nodded. Every cent. He picked up his phone. I'm calling Patricia Walsh now. And Walter. He looked at me over the phone. We are going to need to talk about the house. 40% of that deed has been transferred to an entity that does not legally exist in California. We need to move to have that reversed before anyone tries to act on it. Move fast, I said. That, Dennis said, already dialing, is exactly what I intend to do. I bought that house with Margaret in 1998 for $212,000. We had looked at 11 properties over 4 months, and she had dismissed 10 of them for reasons that ranged from entirely practical to completely inexplicable. Too close to the freeway. Wrong light in the kitchen. One house she walked out of after 30 seconds and refused to explain why. And I had learned enough about Margaret by then to understand that 30 seconds was sometimes all she needed. 847 Maple Drive. She walked into and did not come out for 40 minutes. I found her in the backyard, standing under the oak tree, looking at the fence line with her arms crossed, and an expression I recognized as the one she wore when she had already made a decision and was simply giving it time to become a certainty. The roses along the fence were overgrown and needed cutting back. She was looking at them the way she looked at things she intended to fix. "This one," she said, without turning around. We argued about the front door color for 3 weeks. She wanted sage green. I wanted white. We compromised on sage green, which is what compromising with Margaret generally looked like. I drove home from Glendale on autopilot, which is the only explanation I have for how I arrived in my own driveway without any memory of the last 6 miles. I sat in the car with the engine off and looked at the sage green front door and felt something move through my chest that had no precise name. Grief was part of it, and fury was part of it, and something older and quieter than either of those. The feeling that arrives when something you believed was safe turns out to have been in danger the whole time without your knowledge. 40% of this house, 40% of the oak tree and the fence line and the sage green door. 40% of every morning I had sat at the kitchen table since Margaret died and tried to learn how to live inside a life that no longer had her in it. Someone had filed a document that transferred 40% of all of that to a company that did not legally exist, and they had done it with my name, and I had not known. I went inside. I did not go directly to the kitchen. I walked through the house the way you walk through a structure you are assessing slowly with attention touching things. The hallway where Marcus had scuffed the baseboard with his bicycle wheel 2 summers ago, and I had painted over it rather than repaired it because the scuff mark was his, and I had wanted it to stay. The living room where Margaret's reading chair still sat at the same angle to the lamp because I had not been able to make myself move it to a more practical position. The bedroom doorway where I stopped, as I always stopped, because walking into that room still required a specific kind of effort that I had not yet found a way to make routine. I went to the kitchen instead. I sat at the table in the late afternoon light and put both hands flat on the wood. The surface was worn smooth in the places we had always put our cups. Her side on the right, my side on the left, the grain of the wood faded slightly where our mornings had accumulated for 18 years. I pressed my palms down and felt the solidity of it and thought, this is real. This table is real. This house is real. Margaret planted those roses in 2001, and they come back every July, regardless of what is happening inside the walls, and that is real. What Ryan and Frank had attempted to do with a forged signature and a corrupt notary and a shell company in Nevada, that was also real. But it was a different kind of real. It was the kind that could be dismantled document by document if you had the right people and the right evidence and the willingness to name what had happened without flinching from the name. My throat tightened. My eyes burned with the heat that had been building since I had looked at that grant deed on Dennis's screen and seen my name on a document I had never signed. I pressed the back of my wrist against my mouth and breathed through it the way I had learned to breathe through the things that threatened to undo me. Margaret's diagnosis the night she died, the first morning after the second morning, the 100 mornings after that. I was still breathing when my phone rang. Dennis. "Patricia Walsh can see you tomorrow morning," he said. 8 o'clock, her office in Pasadena. And Robert Kane, the forensic accountant I mentioned, he has cleared his afternoon. We can see him at 2. A pause. "Walter, I want you to know the grant deed is reversible. A forged document filed under fraud is voidable under California law. We are going to get that back." I looked at the worn place on the right side of the table where Margaret had always set her cup. "I know," I said. "Get some rest tonight." "I will." I set the phone down and sat in the kitchen until the light outside shifted from gold to gray. I did not make dinner. I did not turn on the television. I sat at Margaret's table with my hands on the wood and let the house be quiet around me the way it had been quiet on 1,000 evenings before this one. And I told myself what I always told myself when a structure had been damaged and the work of repair was still ahead. You assess, you document, you build. Then I got up, rinsed my coffee cup, and went to bed. My hands, when I lay them flat on the covers in the dark, were steady. My daughter has 3 different voices. The first is the one she uses with Marcus, loose and warm, the voice of a woman who is still in some essential way the girl who used to climb into my truck on Saturday mornings and eat gas station donuts without shame. The second is the voice she uses at dinner parties, polished, slightly elevated, the voice of someone performing a version of themselves for an audience they are trying to impress. The third is the voice she uses when Ryan is in the room. Careful, measured. The voice of someone who has learned to edit themselves in real time, to run every sentence through a filter before letting it out, the way you check a load for stability before you move it. She called me on a Monday evening with the third one. I was at the kitchen table with the green notebook and a cup of coffee when the phone rang, and I looked at her name on the screen for 2 full seconds before I answered. Not because I was afraid of the conversation, because I wanted to be ready for it. Dad. Her voice was even controlled, the temperature of someone who has decided in advance how this call is going to go. Ryan tells me you've been talking to a lawyer. I just want to understand what's happening. We're family. Whatever is going on, we can work it out between us. Emily. I said, did you know about the grant deed on the house? A pause. 3 seconds I counted the way I always counted, because the length of a pause is its own kind of answer. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. But her voice changed on the word no. Just slightly. Just enough. In 34 years of contract negotiations, I had heard that particular shift hundreds of times, the fraction of a second adjustment that separates a statement of fact from a statement of intention. She was not saying she did not know. She was saying she had decided not to know. Okay, I said. Get some sleep, Emily. I heard her breath catch. She had expected more, had prepared for more, had perhaps been given a script that anticipated a longer conversation. The abruptness of my ending, it threw her, and for just a moment before she collected herself and said goodnight in a voice that was trying very hard to sound normal, I heard the third voice slip and something rawer come through underneath it. I set the phone down on Margaret's table and looked at it. Then my laptop chimed with an incoming email. The sender address was a string of letters and numbers I did not recognize, but the domain was CascadePropertyHoldings.com, the Nevada LLC that now claimed 40% of my house. The subject line read, "A conversation before this escalates." The body of the email was brief. Mr. Hayes, we understand you have recently engaged legal counsel. We would suggest a conversation before this matter becomes unnecessarily complicated. The property at 847 Maple Drive has title considerations that may not be fully known to you. We are available at your convenience. I read it twice. Then I called Dennis. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been expecting to hear from me. They emailed you, he said before I could speak. It was not a question. How did you know? Because I found something this afternoon that I was about to call you about. I heard him moving, the sound of a chair papers. Walter, your email account has been compromised. Someone installed a mail forwarding rule. Every email you send or receive has been copied to a secondary address for the past 3 months. A pause. I had my IT consultant look at the account after you told me Emily had been to your house. Whoever set this up needed your password, and the forwarding rule was activated the same week she visited in July. The password used was the one you've had since 2017. The one I had since 2017. The one that contained Margaret's birthday and the year we bought the house, because I had needed something I would not forget. And that was the combination that had come to me without thinking. Emily knew that password. She had watched me type it at this same kitchen table more than once, and I had never thought to change it, because changing it had felt in some way I could not entirely explain, like changing something of Margaret's. My jaw tightened until I felt it in my temples. My hand gripped the phone hard enough that my knuckles ached. Ryan didn't do it himself, Dennis continued. He hired someone, an IT freelancer most likely. They have been reading your correspondence ever since. Another pause. And when Dennis spoke again, his voice carried the particular quiet of a man who has seen enough of human behavior to be unsurprised by it, but not unmoved. The email from the LLC, that is a mistake on their part, Walter. A panicking man's mistake. They know we are building something, and they are trying to find out how far along we are. He let that sit for a moment. Panicking men always overplay their hand. I looked at the email on my screen. Then I looked at the window, at the dark street outside, at the ordinary Monday night neighborhood that had no idea what was happening in this kitchen. Forward everything to me, Dennis said. The email, the account access logs, all of it. And change your password tonight, something with no personal connection. Nothing Margaret, nothing Marcus, nothing they could guess. I understand, I said. And Walter. His voice shifted slightly. The fact that they contacted you directly, that goes into the file. Unsolicited contact from the entity that holds the fraudulent deed after they knew you had legal counsel. That is not a small thing. I closed the laptop. Outside, Margaret's roses were dark shapes against the fence in the August night, and the neighborhood was quiet, and somewhere across town, a panicking man had made his first significant mistake. I changed my password, then I went to bed. In construction, when you suspect a structure has been compromised, you do not guess. You bring in a forensic engineer, someone who can read what the building is trying to tell you, who has the instruments and the training to find what the naked eye misses and the expertise to put it into language a courtroom can understand. Patricia Walsh was that person for documents. Her office was on Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena, 3 blocks from the Caltech campus, in a building that smelled like printer toner and old paper in the particular way that serious workspaces smell. She was in her mid-40s, compact and precise in her movements with the quality of attention that belongs to someone who has spent 20 years looking at things other people overlook. She shook my hand at the door and led me to a work table that was the cleanest surface I had seen in months. Nothing on it except a magnifying lamp, a set of comparison tools I recognized from engineering contexts, and the 3 documents Dennis had sent over the previous afternoon. I've had a preliminary look, she said, pulling on examination gloves with the practiced efficiency of someone who does this 40 times a week. Sit down, Mr. Hayes. This won't take long to explain, but I want you to understand exactly what I'm seeing. I sat. She positioned the magnifying lamp over the loan application from Burbank Community Credit Union and adjusted the angle until the signature at the bottom of the page was illuminated with the clarity of something being examined rather than merely read. A simulated forgery, she said, is different from a traced forgery. A traced forgery follows the actual signature directly. You can see the hesitation marks the places where the pen slowed to stay on the line. A simulated forgery is produced by someone who has studied the original signature and is attempting to reproduce it from memory or from a photographic reference. She pointed to the curve of the W in my first name. Your natural signature has a specific pen lift here, a brief break in the stroke that is consistent across every sample Dennis sent me. This signature does not have that lift. The stroke is continuous, which means the person who wrote it either did not notice the lift in the original or could not reproduce it convincingly. She moved the lamp to the second document, the chase card application. Same issue here. And here, the third document, the grant deed, 6 distinct points of divergence from your known signature. Pen pressure, letter spacing, the angle of your terminal strokes. Scientifically, these documents were not signed by Walter Hayes. My chest loosened with something that was not quite relief. Relief was too simple a word for what I felt, which was the particular satisfaction of a diagnosis that confirms what you already knew and makes it possible to act. I had known those signatures were not mine. Now someone with the credentials and the instruments to say so in a courtroom had put it on paper. "Will you put that in writing?" I asked. "I already have," she said, and slid a bound report across the table. 12 pages tabbed with photographic comparisons on every other page. "Dennis has a copy. This is yours." I thanked her and meant it. She walked me to the door with the brisk warmth of someone who takes satisfaction in her work and does not need to perform that satisfaction for anyone. Robert Kane's office was in Glendale on the 4th floor of a building on Brand Boulevard, 2 blocks from Dennis's office, which I suspected was not a coincidence. Men like Dennis built networks the way engineers built infrastructure, with redundancy and intention. Robert was in his early 50s, heavy-set, with the unhurried manner of someone who processes large amounts of information for a living and has learned that urgency and accuracy are frequently in opposition. He had the transaction records spread across a conference table when I arrived, and he walked me through them the way a teacher walks a student through a proof, not rushing toward the conclusion, but making sure every step was solid before moving to the next. The $47,000 from Burbank Community Credit Union, he said, tapping a printed spreadsheet with one finger. Withdrawn in 4 transactions over 11 days. Each transaction was just under $10,000. He looked at me over his reading glasses. Structuring. Keeping individual withdrawals below the federal reporting threshold of $10,000 to avoid automatic bank scrutiny. That is a separate federal offense from the identity theft itself. My jaw tightened. The design of it, the layers of it, the thought that had gone into every step pressed against my chest with a weight that was almost physical. "Where did the money go?" I asked. 3 destinations. He turned the spreadsheet toward me. 40% to a personal account I've traced to a business entity in Ryan Caldwell's name, a sole proprietorship he registered in California 18 months ago that has no public business activity. 30% to what appears to be a credit card debt payment, likely personal. The remaining 30%. He paused the pause of a man who is about to say something that will land hard, to a Nevada account associated with Cascade Property Holdings, LLC. They had used my money to fund the entity that was stealing my house. I sat with that for a moment and breathed through the fury of it, the sheer architectural audacity of it, the way a man with no conscience could look at something like that and feel nothing but satisfaction at how neatly it worked. "Can you document all of this?" I asked. Robert Kane looked at me with the mild expression of a man who has been asked whether he can do the thing he has spent 30 years doing. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I already have." He slid a second bound report across the table. 17 pages fully sourced with transaction records attached as exhibits. I set it on top of Patricia Walsh's report and held both of them in my hands for a moment. The weight of them, the solid, documented, factual weight of 2 people who had looked at what Ryan Caldwell had built and translated it into language that could not be argued with. I called Dennis from the parking garage. Patricia's report confirms simulated forgeries on all 3 documents, I said. 6 points of divergence on the grant deed alone. Robert traced the Burbank loan funds. 40% went directly to Ryan's business account. 30% to Cascade Property Holdings. A pause. Then Dennis said with the quiet of a man who has been building towards something and can now see it clearly. We have everything we need, Walter. The question now is timing. I looked at the 2 reports in my hand. 34 years of construction had taught me one thing about timing above all others. You pour the concrete when the foundation is ready. Not before. Not after. Schedule the filing, I said. We're ready. Ryan Caldwell had arranged what he called a family meeting. In my experience, when someone has to call it a family meeting, it has already stopped being one. The house in Glendale was a craftsman bungalow, on a street full of craftsman bungalows, the kind of neighborhood that looks settled and permanent from the outside. Inside, the living room had been arranged with the deliberate casualness of someone who had thought carefully about where everyone should sit. Frank Caldwell occupied the armchair nearest the window, the power position, the one that catches the most light and puts everyone else slightly at a disadvantage. Diane Caldwell sat at the far end of the sofa and said nothing the entire evening, which told me everything I needed to know about how that household worked. 2 cousins of Ryan's, whose names I had never retained, sat on folding chairs that had been brought in specifically for the occasion, which told me this meeting had been planned far enough in advance to require furniture logistics. Emily sat beside Ryan on the love seat. Her hands were in her lap. Her shoulders were drawn in slightly, the way they had been at the Father's Day dinner, the way they had been every time I had seen her in Ryan's presence in the past year. I noticed it the way you notice a recurring stress fracture in a material not dramatic, not immediately catastrophic, but there and consistent and worth paying attention to. Ryan opened with the voice he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. It was a good voice for that warm, measured the voice of a man who has been told he has a gift for bringing people together. Walter, I'm glad you came. I know things have been tense. I know there have been misunderstandings. I think if we can all just sit down and talk like adults, we can figure this out together. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the posture of openness. We have something here we'd like to share with you. He produced a document from the coffee table, cream-colored folder, multiple pages, a title I could read from where I sat. Voluntary Asset Management Agreement. This is a simplified version of what Emily brought you, Ryan said. Simpler language, narrower scope. We just want to make sure that as you get older, someone you trust has the ability to step in if you need help. That's all this is, Walter. Family taking care of family. Frank nodded from his armchair with the gravity of a man endorsing something he helped design. The 2 cousins looked at me with the politely concerned expressions of people who had been briefed but not fully informed. I looked at the document. Then I looked at Ryan. Then I reached into the bag I had brought and set 2 bound reports on the coffee table between us. Patricia Walsh's report on top, Robert Kane's report beneath it. Before we discuss asset management, I said, I'd like to discuss the 3 documents that bear my forged signature. The room changed temperature. Ryan's posture shifted barely just a fraction, the adjustment of a man recalculating. Frank's eyes moved from the reports to my face and back again. The 2 cousins exchanged a glance that confirmed they had not been told about this part. Walter? Ryan's voice had lost some of its warmth, replaced by something that was trying to sound patient, but was not quite getting there. I don't know what you think you have there, but... Page 4 of the first report. I said identifies 6 points of divergence between my actual signature and the signature on the grant deed, filed with the Los Angeles County Recorder's Office on July 2nd. Page 9 of the second report traces 40% of the funds from a fraudulent personal loan to a business account registered in your name. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. These are not allegations. These are documented findings from a forensic document examiner and a forensic accountant. Both are prepared to testify. Frank Caldwell stood up from his armchair, and his face had gone from composed to something considerably less controlled. His voice came out louder than the room required. You're a paranoid old man who is trying to destroy your own daughter's marriage over a misunderstanding about some paperwork? I did not look at Frank. I looked at Emily, and in that moment, in the space of a single second, while Frank's voice was still filling the room, I saw what I had been trying not to see for months. Emily was not angry. She was not defending Ryan. She was not looking at me with the cold expression she had worn the night she brought the POA documents to my kitchen table. She was looking at her hands, which were pressed flat and white-knuckled against her thighs, and her jaw was tight, and her shoulders had drawn in so far they were almost touching. And she was breathing in the careful, controlled way of someone who has learned that taking up too much air in a room can have consequences. She was not on Ryan's side. She was afraid of him. The distinction hit me somewhere below the sternum, sharp and clarifying and devastating, all at once. The way a structural diagnosis hits you when you finally understand that the damage is not where you thought it was, and is both worse and more repairable than you had believed. I stood up. I collected both reports from the coffee table and put them back in my bag. Then I looked at Ryan with the expression I had spent 34 years developing. The one that communicates that I have assessed the situation completely and reached my conclusions and am not available for further negotiation. You've mistaken my patience for weakness, I said. Engineers are patient. We wait until the structure shows us exactly where it's going to fail. I said goodnight to Frank, who did not respond. I said nothing to the cousins. At the door I paused and looked back at Emily just for a moment, just long enough for her to feel that I had looked, and what I put into that look was not anger and not disappointment, but something I hoped she could read accurately. I see you. I know what is happening to you, and I am not done yet. Then I walked out into the Glendale night and heard Ryan's voice rise behind me as the door closed, and I did not turn around. There are two kinds of silence after a storm. The first is the silence of destruction, the particular quiet that follows something that cannot be undone when the air itself seems to be holding its breath over what has been lost. The second is the silence of clearing the silence that comes when the worst has passed, and what remains is still standing, damaged perhaps, but standing, and the work of assessment can begin. Emily's voice on the phone that Tuesday morning was the second kind. Dad. Just the one word, and in it I heard exhaustion, and something that had been pressed down for a long time, beginning to find its way back to the surface. Can I come over alone? She arrived 40 minutes later, before Ryan's car would have had time to leave their driveway and return. She was wearing the kind of clothes people wear when appearance has stopped mattering, a gray sweatshirt, jeans, her hair pulled back without ceremony. No bag, no folder, no documents. She sat down at the kitchen table and placed her phone face down on the wood, and for the first time in months I recognized the gesture as something other than distraction. She was turning off the possibility of being monitored. I poured 2 cups of coffee without asking. She wrapped both hands around hers the way she had done since she was 19, and the familiarity of it made my throat tighten with something I was not prepared for, the particular ache of watching your child sit at your table and recognizing them again after a long absence. I didn't know about the loan, she said. Her voice was low and careful, the voice of someone who has rehearsed the words, not to perform them, but to make sure she could get through them without breaking apart. I swear to you, Dad, I knew about the POA. Ryan said it was normal estate planning, that everyone did it, that I was helping you. But the loan, the deed, the credit card. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together and breathed and kept going. He didn't tell me. I found out the same way everyone else does, by accident, by seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. I looked at my daughter across Margaret's table, and I made the decision I had been approaching for weeks. I believed her. Not because I was her father and wanted to believe her, though both of those things were true, but because I had sat across from her at the family meeting 2 nights ago and watched a woman who was not defending her husband. She was surviving him. Emily, I said, do you understand that what Ryan did is a felony in California? Her chin trembled once hard, the way a structure shudders when a load it was not designed for is placed upon it. Yes, she said. I know. Are you safe? I asked. At home. Are you safe? Her eyes filled and she blinked rapidly and pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth, a gesture so identical to one I had seen in my own mirror that it stopped my breath for a moment. He doesn't. It's not like that. He doesn't. She stopped, started again. He just makes everything very small. Does that make sense? He makes the world very small until there's only his version of it left. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. Her fingers were cold. I know, I said. I saw it. 2 nights ago. I looked at you and I saw it. She broke then, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that people break when they have been holding something for so long that the simple act of being seen is enough to undo them. Her shoulders shook. She pressed both hands flat against her face and wept into her palms, and I sat with her and did not try to stop it, because it was not the kind of crying that needed to be stopped. It was the kind that needed to be finished. When she lifted her face, her eyes were swollen, and her voice was steady in the way that voices get steady after a storm has passed. There's something else, she said. She picked up her phone and turned it over and opened her messages and slid it across the table toward me. I took a screenshot 3 weeks ago. I didn't know what to do with it. I was afraid. The messages were between Ryan and Frank Caldwell. The language was careful, the language of men who knew they were putting something in writing and had tried to be oblique about it without quite succeeding. Ryan Phase 2. The doctor visit. H can handle the eval. Once that's on record, his signature means nothing. Frank, make sure it's someone he's never met. Keep it clean, Ryan already scheduled. Dad won't know until he's sitting in the office. I read the messages 3 times. My hand on the phone was very still. H, I said. Do you know who H is? Emily shook her head. But Dennis, when I called him an hour later, knew within 40 minutes. Dr. Gerald Harmon, a private psychiatric evaluator in Encino, who had 2 complaints filed against him with the California Medical Board, both for issuing capacity evaluations without conducting proper examinations. The kind of doctor who for the right fee could produce a document stating that a 66-year-old retired engineer was no longer capable of managing his own financial affairs. And with that document under California Probate Code, Section 1800, Ryan and Frank could petition the court to appoint a conservator for Walter Hayes, someone to manage his assets, sign his documents, and make his decisions. The process alone, Dennis told me, could take months and cost tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, and would create a permanent public record questioning my mental capacity. That was phase 2. Not my money, not my house, my name, my voice, my right to stand in a court and say I did not sign that. I sat at the kitchen table after Emily left and looked at the place where her coffee cup had been, and I felt the full dimensions of what had been planned, the layers of it, The patience of it. The way it had been built to take everything from me without ever leaving a mark that looked like violence. Then I picked up my phone and called Dennis. They were going to take my voice, I said. Yes, Dennis said. And that is exactly why we are going to file first. Dennis Okafor has two expressions that matter. The first is the one that means this is complicated. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a particular stillness about the mouth. The expression of a man recalibrating his assessment of a situation he had believed he understood. The second is the one that means this is serious, a complete settling of his face, every unnecessary tension released, leaving only the clear, unadorned attention of someone who has decided that what is in front of him requires everything he has. When I walked into his office that Wednesday morning and told him about Phase 2, he showed me the second one. He did not speak for almost a full minute. He sat with the screenshots Emily had sent to my phone. I had forwarded them to him the night before, and he read them the way he read everything that mattered, which was slowly and more than once. Then he set the phone down on the desk and looked at me with that settled, serious face and said what needed to be said. A fraudulent conservatorship petition is the most aggressive form of elder financial abuse in California, he said. Not because of what it takes from you immediately, because of what it does to your ability to fight back. He leaned forward. If Ryan and Frank file that petition before we act, the burden shifts. You would be in a position of proving your own competence to a court that has already received documentation, however fraudulent, suggesting otherwise. The process alone could take 6 months. It could cost you $50,000 in legal fees. And every day it runs, there is a public record with your name on it, saying that someone believed you could not manage your own affairs. He paused. That is what they were counting on. Not a conviction, a process. I understood. I had seen it in construction, the developer who does not need to win the lawsuit, only to keep the contractor tied up in litigation long enough that the contractor runs out of money and settles for whatever is offered. The weapon is not the outcome. The weapon is the time. What do we do? I asked. We file first, Dennis said. Today. He pulled his legal pad across the desk and began writing with the focused efficiency of a man who has already thought this through and is now simply executing. 2 documents, filed simultaneously. The first, an ex parte motion at Los Angeles Superior Court, an emergency application requesting an immediate hearing to void the fraudulent grant deed on 847 Maple Drive. An ex parte motion, Dennis explained, bypasses the standard scheduling process when there is documented risk of irreparable harm. With Patricia Walsh's forensic report confirming forgery and the grant deed filed against a property I had owned outright for 9 years, the risk was documented and the harm was concrete. The court could grant an emergency hearing within 2 to 3 weeks. The second, a formal complaint to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office Elder Abuse Section, a dedicated prosecutorial unit that handled exactly these cases. The complaint would include every piece of evidence we had assembled: Patricia Walsh's forgery analysis, Robert Kane's financial trace, Jordan Cole's witness statement about the CVV, the alibi documentation from Seattle, the email from Cascade Property Holdings, LLC after Walter had engaged counsel, and the screenshots of Ryan and Frank's messages about Phase 2. The DA's office will open an investigation, Dennis said. That does 2 things. It creates an official record that Ryan and Frank cannot simply make disappear, and it significantly complicates their ability to file any conservatorship petition, because any attorney they approach will now have to consider that their clients are under active criminal investigation. He slid the documents across the desk toward me. 2 stacks each flagged with colored tabs at the signature lines. I picked up the pen. I read every page before I signed it. Every clause, every paragraph, every line of the attachments. It took 40 minutes. Dennis sat across from me and drank his coffee and did not rush me because he knew the way men who have known each other 40 years know things without saying them, that this was not slowness. This was 34 years of never signing anything I had not read. When I reached the last signature line on the last document, I stopped for a moment. Not from hesitation, from the particular quality of attention that a significant moment deserves the same attention I had given to the first signature on the first major contract of my career. The same attention I had given to the mortgage on 847 Maple Drive in 1998. The same attention Margaret had described once with the combination of exasperation and affection that had been her particular gift, as my habit of treating every piece of paper like it might be the most important one I ever touched. She had not been wrong. I signed my name, clearly completely with the pen lift between the W and the A, that Patricia Walsh had identified as the mark that could not be faked. Dennis collected the documents and squared the edges against the desk with a single firm tap. He looked at his watch. "In War 47, he said. "We file electronically in the next 10 minutes. The court will have it before 5. He looked at me. "Walter, I want you to understand something. From this moment forward, the initiative belongs to us. They have been driving this. As of today, we are." I looked at the empty signature lines where my name had just been, and I thought about the $47,000 and the grant deed and Phase 2 and the bread basket on a white tablecloth on Father's Day, and Marcus asking me in a careful, rehearsed voice whether I was going to go away. I thought about all of it, and I felt something settle in my chest that had not been settled since June. "Good," I said. "Let's finish it." Dennis filed at 4:53. 7 minutes later, my phone buzzed with the court's electronic confirmation. Case number, filing date, assigned department. I held the phone and looked at the confirmation number on the screen, and I thought, this is the most important structure I have ever built. And the foundation is solid. I have stood on job sites in the rain, in 100-degree heat, and once in the immediate aftermath of a minor earthquake that relocated a retaining wall 40 feet from where it had been engineered to stand. A courtroom in downtown Los Angeles was just another job site. Different materials, same principles. You assess the structure. You present your findings. You let the evidence speak in the language it was designed to speak. I left the old jacket at home that morning. Margaret had bought it for Emily's graduation. It belonged to a different kind of occasion than this one. I wore the navy suit I had purchased 3 weeks earlier, new clean chosen specifically for this day, and I stood at the bathroom mirror and straightened the lapels and thought she would have approved of this one too. Dennis was waiting for me outside Department 47 of the Los Angeles Superior Court at 8:45. He had his briefcase, his legal pad, and the particular stillness of a man who has done this many times and knows that composure is not a feeling, but a decision. He shook my hand without ceremony and said, "Ready, Orange Taxi?" And I said yes, and we went in. Ryan was already seated at the respondent's table with a lawyer I did not recognize, young, expensive suit, the slightly over-prepared look of someone who had been handed a bad case on short notice, and knew it. Frank Caldwell sat in the gallery behind them, his arms crossed his jaw, set the posture of a man who still believed the room could be controlled if he simply refused to acknowledge that it couldn't. Emily was not there. I had not expected her to be, and I was glad. The judge was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses she wore at the end of her nose, and she read our filing the way Dennis read things, slowly, completely, with the expression of someone who does not move to conclusions before the evidence warrants it. The courtroom was quiet, except for the sound of pages turning. Ryan's lawyer shifted in his chair twice. Ryan himself sat very still, which told me more than movement would have. The judge read for 22 minutes. Then she set the filing down and looked over her glasses at Ryan's attorney. "Counsel," she said, and her voice had the particular quality of a question that is not actually a question. "Your client's handwriting characteristics appear on a loan application submitted in Mr. Hayes's name on March 14th of this year. Mr. Hayes has produced documentation placing him in Seattle on that date, hotel records, airline records, a conference attendance log. Your client's known handwriting samples were analyzed by a certified forensic document examiner and found to match the forged application at multiple points." She paused. "Can you offer this court an explanation for that?" Ryan's attorney stood. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He asked for a continuance. The judge did not grant it. She granted our motion. The grant deed transferring 40% of 847 Maple Drive to Cascade Property Holdings, LLC, was voided as of that morning. The second mortgage was frozen pending full investigation. The court issued a notation that the matter had been referred to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, which Dennis had already handled, but which the court's formal acknowledgement made permanent in the record. Ryan's attorney said something in a low voice to Ryan. Ryan's face did not change. He had the frozen expression of a man who has been running a calculation for months and has just watched the numbers come up wrong in a room full of witnesses. Frank Caldwell stood up from the gallery and walked out without looking at anyone. I heard the door close behind him. I picked up my copy of the judge's order from the table, squared the edges, and put it in my briefcase. 34 years of construction had taught me that the moment a major phase completed was not the moment for celebration. It was the moment for documentation. You recorded what had been accomplished. Then you moved to the next phase. Dennis and I walked out of Department 47 into the October sunshine on Temple Street, and the air was warm and smelled like the city. And I stood on the courthouse steps and let myself breathe it in for exactly 1 moment before the next thing began. "First foundation poured," Dennis said. "Now we build," I said. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. Emily. I looked at her name on the screen and felt the particular, complicated weight of it. All the love and all the damage and all the distance that had accumulated between that name and this moment. Then I answered it. "Dad." Her voice was thick with something that was trying to become relief and had not quite arrived there yet. "Is it done?" "The house is ours," I said. It was always ours. She didn't speak for a moment, and I heard her breath catch and release in the way breath does when the thing you have been bracing for does not arrive, and the bracing itself becomes the thing that breaks you. Then she said quietly, "Okay." And I heard in that single word everything she was not yet able to say out loud. "Okay," I said back. Justice in the real world does not arrive with music. It arrives as paperwork. Telephone calls from attorneys at 9 in the morning. Emails with document attachments and case reference numbers. A notification from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office that an investigation has been opened, followed 3 weeks later by a notification that a plea agreement has been reached. Justice in the real world looks like a stack of documents on a conference table, and the stack either grows in your favor or it doesn't. And what determines which way it grows is the quality of the foundation you built before anyone was watching. Dennis called me on a Thursday morning in late October with the voice he used when something had resolved in the direction we had hoped. "Ryan's attorney contacted the DA's office," he said. "They want to negotiate. The plea agreement took 11 days to finalize." I did not attend the negotiations. Dennis represented my interests, and he called me each evening with an update, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and listened and gave my answers in the measured way I gave all answers that mattered. The terms Ryan Caldwell would plead guilty to 2 counts of identity theft under California Penal Code 530.5 and 1 count of elder financial abuse under California Welfare and Institutions Code 156. 30. Full restitution of $132,000 to be paid within 12 months. 3 years of formal probation. And this one Dennis had pushed for specifically because he understood what it meant, a permanent revocation of Ryan Caldwell's California real estate broker license. Not prison. I want to be clear about that because I know how it sounds. Ryan Caldwell would not go to prison. He would, however, carry a felony conviction for the rest of his professional life. He would lose the license that was the only credential he had ever built anything on. The $132,000 would have to come from somewhere, and given what Robert Kane had documented about his finances, finding it was not going to be a comfortable process. And every future employer, every future partner, every future client who ran a basic background check would find the same thing: identity theft, elder, financial abuse, guilty plea, Los Angeles County, 20 and 25. I agreed to the terms, not because it was everything, but because Marcus needed his father present and because Emily was going to need him to be functional for what was coming next, and because I was 66 years old, and I had learned something that younger men sometimes miss, that the most durable victories are the ones that do not require you to become someone you would not recognize. Frank Caldwell was not charged. The evidence connected him to the conspiracy and the messages Emily had screenshot. But conspiracy charges require a higher evidentiary threshold. And Dennis told me honestly that the DA's office did not believe they could prove it beyond reasonable doubt. The messages went into the file. The file would remain open. I had made my peace with that. Mostly. Then Dennis called on a Friday afternoon in November with the thing I had not expected. I ran a standard background check on Frank Caldwell, he said. Standard practice when building a complete case file. Walter. A pause. The pause of a man who is about to say something that will change the shape of what you thought you understood. 12 years ago in New York, there was a civil dispute. The plaintiff was a woman named Carol Reeves, Frank Caldwell's younger sister. I set down my coffee cup. She sued Frank and his wife over their mother's estate. Dennis continued. $280,000. The suit alleged that Frank had manipulated their mother's financial documents in the final years of her life, redirecting assets that should have been distributed equally. A long pause. The case was settled out of court with a confidentiality agreement before it went to trial. The kitchen was very quiet around me. Outside, Margaret's roses were still holding their last blooms of the season red against the November gray. He's done this before, I said. Yes, Dennis said, to his own sister, over his own mother's estate. His voice carried the quiet weight of a man who has seen enough of human nature to be unsurprised by its patterns while still being moved by their specific instances. You were not his first target, Walter. You were just the first one who built a better case than he did. I sat with that for a long time after Dennis hung up. I thought about Carol Reeves, whoever she was, a woman in New York 12 years ago, who had watched her brother take what her mother had meant for both of them and had fought back and had settled for silence because silence was what the system offered her. I thought about what it had cost her to take that settlement, whether she had spent the years since wondering if she should have fought harder, whether she had watched her brother move to California and build a new life and hoped that distance meant he had changed. I thought about all the people I would never know about, all the Carols. How many people I thought didn't fight back. 3 weeks later, Emily called to tell me she had filed for divorce. She said it the way she said everything those days, quietly, directly, without performance. She had retained an attorney. She had found an apartment in Pasadena 12 minutes from Marcus's school. I didn't ask questions. I didn't offer opinions. I said the only thing that was true and useful and mine to give. "My door is open," I said. "Whenever you're ready to walk through it." She said she knew. And then she said thank you in a voice that carried everything the word was too small to hold. And we said good night. And I sat in the kitchen with the phone in my hand and felt the particular complicated grief of a father who has gotten his daughter back by watching her world fall apart. Some victories cost more than others. That does not make them the wrong ones. The apartment on Ocean Avenue was smaller than the house on Maple Drive by about 800 square feet. I did not mind. I had learned that the size of a space has nothing to do with how much room there is to breathe. I moved in on a Saturday in early December with the help of 2 men from a moving company and a borrowed dolly, and by noon I had the kitchen set up and the bedroom arranged, and Margaret's reading chair positioned at the angle to the window that caught the afternoon light, the same way it had caught it in Pasadena. Some things you carry with you not because you cannot let go, but because they are simply yours, and there is no version of your life in which they do not belong. I did not sell the house on Maple Drive. I could not bring myself to do it, and I stopped trying to convince myself that I should. Instead, I found a tenant, through a property management company, a woman named Lynn, a school teacher, quiet and careful, who asked during the walkthrough whether she could keep the rose bushes along the back fence. I told her yes. I told her the woman who planted them would have wanted someone to care for them. Lynn nodded as if she understood exactly what I meant, and I believed that she did. The first Saturday morning in Santa Monica, I woke before 6 and lay in the dark listening to the sound of the ocean 4 blocks away. It is a sound unlike any other, not loud, not dramatic, just consistent the way good structure is consistent, the way things built to last. Announce themselves not through spectacle, but through simple daily endurance. I made coffee. I walked down Ocean Avenue in the December morning with my hands in my jacket pockets and the Pacific air on my face cool and salt-sharp. And I bought a black coffee at a place called The Ordinary and sat at a table on the sidewalk and watched the morning happen around me. Marcus arrived first, running ahead of Emily, the way 9-year-olds run, not toward anything specific, just forward, because forward is where the energy wants to go. He was taller than I remembered, which is the thing about grandchildren. You do not notice them growing until suddenly they are not quite the same height they were in your memory. He talked about baseball for 6 minutes without pausing. I listened to every word. Emily sat across from me with her coffee and did not say much, which was all right. Some mornings, things do not need to be talked through. Some mornings just need to be sat in together with the understanding that the sitting is itself enough. The check came to $19. I paid it and did not think about the amount for even a moment. Then my phone buzzed with a text from a number I knew well by now. "Mr. Hayes, just got my paralegal certification. First try. Southwestern awarded it this morning. I wanted you to know." I looked at Jordan's message for a long moment. I thought about a young man running across a parking lot on a warm June evening with a folded piece of paper in his hand and a decision that had cost him something. I thought about what it means to see something wrong and choose not to look away from it, even when looking away would be easier, even when you are 24 years old and afraid, and the person wronged is a stranger you owe nothing to. I typed back, "You did the hard part, Jordan. I just gave you a reason to." I set the phone face down on the table next to my coffee and looked out at Ocean Avenue and the strip of blue Pacific visible at the end of the block. They had given me a bread basket at a white tablecloth restaurant in June because they believed I did not deserve a seat at the table. What they had not understood, what men like Ryan and Frank never understand about men like me, is that I had spent 34 years building tables. I knew how tables were made. I knew what made them hold. And the one I was sitting at now in the December sun on Ocean Avenue with my grandson's voice and the sound of the ocean, and $19 on the check, nobody had a claim on it, but me. I believe God never designed family to be a transaction. He designed it to be a foundation. When that foundation is built on control and fear, it will crack. Not if. When. Here is my honest truth: I stayed quiet too long. I called it keeping the peace. I was only delaying the damage. If you see the pressure, the isolation, the small surrenders becoming permanent, do not wait the way I waited. Choose earlier than I did. No amount of money or inheritance is worth your name. Protect it. Someone waiting too long to act is the one thing every story like this has in common. This one cost me months. It does not have to cost you the same. If this story reached you, leave a comment below. I read every single one. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. Some stories on this channel contain fictional elements built for educational purposes. If this content is not for you, we respect that completely. Please feel free to find what fits you best.